been working on Graywater and working on policy development for reuse in the state for 3 years, and the Ashland community has been probably the most supportive and encouraging and very active in looking at ways of conserving water. And you guys are really into Graywater, and that excites me because I think this is some place where we really can see a difference in the state, where Graywater can make a difference. All right, so in this introductory sort of discussion, I'm going to just introduce Graywater, the state regulations for reuse, and I'm going to do that by trying to answer a lot of questions. But the one question that I really can't answer is the first one, and that's why are you here? And so that's something that as we go through this, maybe well, first of all, think about that, and then as we go through what is Graywater, how can you use Graywater, maybe your perceptions of why you're here may change a little bit, and that's okay. But I want you to kind of think about that and always remember why are you here. I'm going to start off with a little bit of history of Graywater in the state of Oregon.
Upper right.
The upper right?
Yeah.
That one?
Maybe it doesn't work.
All right. Well, no pointers. But so starting on the left of this chart. So early history. I mean, people have been using Graywater for as long as we've had water. I mean, water is a valuable resource. And it's only really in more of our more modern culture where water has become plentiful and we kind of have lost value and understanding of the value of water. And so we really haven't been paying a lot of attention to where our water comes from and where it goes when we're done with it. And we're shifting back towards that idea of let's reuse water. So we're getting more like those people who came west, on the wagon train, and they knew how to reuse their water. In the state of Oregon, Graywater is defined under statute as sewage. So it's considered domestic household sewage. And it still is, even with legislative changes. So always bear that in mind. Under current law, there were two ways to dispose of Graywater. One of those is something called the split waste method. And so if you were living in a rural location, you had an on-site system, it said you could put in a composting toilet, and then you could put your Graywater into a separate septic tank and reduce the size of the drain field. That was one way to dispose of Graywater. The other way that you're allowed to dispose of Graywater are Graywater waste disposal sumps. And those are what you find in campgrounds. And it allows you to dispose of 10 gallons per day of hand-carried Graywater. So that's it. And those are the only ways that you could actually dispose of Graywater. Now, there was a lot of interest in looking at ways to conserve water, and that started growing a lot. And in 2005, there was an urban reuse task force, and it was put together by the governor's office. And that group came together, and they were looking for ways to conserve water in urban environments. And they identified Graywater as a key way to reuse water. But they also realized that there were some big hurdles to actually seeing that occur. And those had to do with, there were some legal complications, and also they recognized that there wasn't a lot of history or a lot of research on Graywater to really show if it was safe to use or not. So nothing really happened until 2008. And in 2008, state plumbing code changed, and it allowed Graywater to be reused for toilet and urinal flushing in a house. And so you can do that right now with the plumbing code. You can get a plumbing permit. You can put in a little Graywater system, and you can flush your toilets. And that is something that you can do, and it does not involve DEQ. So it wasn't until June of 2009, so 3 years ago, that the governor signed into law the Graywater law, and that allows people to reuse Graywater for other things. So taking the water outside of your house, using it for irrigation is probably the big thing. And so after that occurred, DEQ's first job was we put together a 14-person advisory committee, and we asked them, give us ideas on how to do this. How can we reuse Graywater and do it safely and save people money and really make a difference? And so these 14 people came from across the state. We had somebody from Ashland who served on that committee, Vicki Simpson. She was with Jackson Soil and Water Conservation at that time. And that group gave us some really great ideas. And so through a long process, public involvement process, in August of 2009, the state adopted new rules that allowed for the reuse of Graywater. And that's where we're at today. We have rules on the books, and we have ways that you can reuse Graywater. So to start with, what is Graywater? So gray water is defined in statute. And so it is wastewater, it's domestic wastewater that comes from showers and baths, kitchen sinks, bathroom sinks, and laundries. So there are 4 sources of gray water. Those are defined in statute. That's not something that DEQ can change. So that's something that is in statute. And it does not mean any toilet water waste or waste contaminated by soiled diapers.
Can you stand to the left of the podium?
All right. Is that better? All right. So why use gray water? There are a lot of good reasons for using gray water. Right now, we have changing climate. The maps up in the upper left, those come from the Water Resources Department, and they're predicting with climate change what's going to happen with water distribution in the state. And what they are telling us is the total quantity of precipitation we're going to get probably isn't going to change a whole lot, but it's going to be rainfall and not a snowpack. So we don't get any water storage. So we need to be smarter about using our water. Another thing is we have more and more people coming into the states. We have increasing demand on our water resources. We have a lot of people who are trying to use water, and our current water is already over-allocated in the state, so we need to come up with innovative ways to use water. And we have a lot of conflicting uses. Now locally, I think there are some additional reasons that you should be interested in using gray water. First of all, the Ashland wastewater treatment facility is a very chemical-dependent sort of treatment process, as I understand, from the DEQ engineers. And by reducing wastewater flows to the treatment plant, you're actually saving chemical costs, and so you are actually saving the city money. That's a good thing. Another thing is that the Ashland wastewater treatment facility discharges into a water body that is limited by thermal loads. So that means that the water that's going into the creek is too hot, and so it has to be cooled down in some manner. So by reducing the amount of wastewater that's going to the discharge, you actually are improving water quality in the state. So one of the ways, I think that's very, very exciting, that by actually, if we get enough people who are using gray water, you're reducing wastewater flows, you're improving water quality. That's really great. And lastly, the thing that a lot of people get excited about is that potentially you can save money if you reuse gray water. So anytime that you are using gray water to irrigate your lawn, as opposed to pulling out your potable water supply, you are saving money. All right, I can't really talk a whole lot about gray water alone without just kind of reminding you that gray water isn't the single solution. One of the things to always remind yourself of is that reduce, reuse, recycle. We talk about this a lot when we're talking about solid waste, but we also need to think about this when we think about water as well. So the first thing, if you are really interested in water, is water conservation. So what can you do to reduce the amount of water that you're using? That's the first thing to consider. The second thing is to reuse your water. And that's what we're here really to talk about, is that second step, is how can you reuse your gray water. And then the third thing is the recycling. And I argue that, that excess water that does go to the wastewater treatment facility does get recycled. So it does get treated, it goes into a stream, it goes down, it flows downstream, and then somebody else actually can use that. So that is actually a kind of recycling. But that is the last sort of option in our reduce, reuse, recycle loop. So what's in gray water? Gray water shares very similar chemical and biological characteristics to combined household wastewater, but at lower concentrations. So there is organic material, which we measure as biochemical oxygen demand. That's the technical term. There's a lot of solids. You can have some limited nutrients. So there is some nitrogen and phosphorus in gray water, but it's pretty limited. So you don't get a lot of benefit by irrigating with gray water because you aren't really going to do any fertilizing. Gray water can have oil and grease and bacteria. So these are kind of some of the bad things that you have to be concerned about. And this is particularly true if your gray water comes from your kitchen sink. So think about that. Anything that's going down your kitchen sink is going out in your gray water. And lastly, gray water can contain anything else you put down the kitchen sink or bathroom sink or showers or laundries. So bleaches, chemicals, personal care products, anything you put down your drain potentially is in your gray water, and if you are reusing it and putting it out on your landscape, you could have a problem. So remember, Graywater is a cleaner source of water that can be reused. It's not toilet water, but it's not drinking water either. And so that's one of the things always to keep in mind. Your graywater will actually, the quality of graywater varies by source as well. So remember, there are 4 sources as defined under statute: showers and baths. Great source of graywater. It's clean, very predictable. You take, X number of showers a week, and it's for a certain period of time, so you know how much water you're producing. So it's very easy, and it's a very good idea to reuse a shower of graywater. Bathroom sinks, very low volumes. There's a lot of personal care products, toothpaste, shaving cream, that sort of thing goes down your kitchen or your bathroom sinks. Low volume, there's benefit in harvesting it, but there isn't as much benefit as your shower. Laundries are also an excellent way to reuse graywater. If you're getting into graywater reuse initially, this is probably the place to start. Because once again, like the showers, you know how often you wash your clothes, and how many times a week. So it's a very predictable volume of water that's being produced from your laundries, and it's very easy to retrofit those as compared to a lot of the other sources of graywater in your house. And the things to think about with your laundry are that laundry detergents can be pretty harsh chemicals sometimes, depending upon what you're using. So if you are trying to irrigate acid-loving plants, like blueberries or azaleas or rhododendrons, they aren't going to like laundry water unless you actually are conscious about keeping the pH a little bit lower. The other thing is that if you really like to do it yourself and make your own laundry soap, I know people who use borax. Boron is really hard on soils and plants, so you'd really be aware of that. The last source of graywater that you can harvest from is your kitchen sink. Kitchen sinks are a challenge, and it's fairly new in the graywater realm of harvesting graywater from kitchen sinks, because there's a lot of stuff that goes down your kitchen sink. There's a lot of solids, a lot of organics. So we kind of consider that to be dark graywater in a lot of ways, just because it's more contaminated. But you can reuse it. There's just some special precautions you have to think about if you want to reuse graywater from the kitchen sink. You need to reduce kind of the solids. You need to reduce some of your fats, oils, and greases that would be present in your graywater. How much graywater is produced? Well, based upon a typical North American household, 60% of your household wastewater can be attributed to graywater sources. So if you are a typical North American household, that is between 90 and 110 gallons of water per day. I think that number reflects people who don't think about that reduce, reuse, recycle, because 100 gallons or 110 gallons per day of graywater is a lot of graywater. So I would hope that most people are producing less than that just by implementing a lot of water conservation measures. But the point of this is that there is a significant amount of water that is graywater, and you can harvest it and reuse it, and that's really a good thing. Another question, is graywater safe to use? This comes up a lot. As DEQ and our advisory committee were trying to answer this question, we looked at studies, and you will hear it a lot from people who are really advocating for graywater reuse. There are no studies showing that graywater has ever caused illness. But on the flip side, we also could not find any studies that said that illnesses in households that use graywater were not caused by graywater use. So, I mean, there isn't a lot of information out there. But what we have concluded is that you can safely reuse graywater. Yes, there are organic materials, there are bacteria, there might even be viruses, but you can safely reuse graywater. And what we did in developing rules was come up with how to safely reuse graywater. All right, so and because it is safe to reuse graywater, it is now official public policy in the state of Oregon to encourage the beneficial reuse of graywater, provided that it's protective of public health, protective of the environment, and provides a beneficial resource value. And what we talk about, and this comes out of statute, is these are graywater reuse and disposal systems. And what this means is that you have a graywater collection system, and it has some sort of diversion device on that system so that you can reuse it when it's appropriate to reuse it. And if you have, if you're washing diapers or somebody's sick in your house, that you also can switch a valve and you can send it to your disposal system. So they are graywater reuse and disposal systems. There's two sides to this. how can I use gray water? As I already mentioned, currently under state plumbing code, you can reuse gray water for toilet and urinal flushing. This activity is regulated solely under the plumbing code, no DEQ involvement in these systems at all. The one thing I will note here that the definition under plumbing code of gray water does not include kitchen sinks. So you cannot harvest from your kitchen sink if you want to use it for toilet or urinal flushing. The other big thing, and this is what we're going to focus on today a lot, is subsurface irrigation. So subsurface irrigation of gardens, lawns, and landscape plants, food crops. So this excludes root crops such as potatoes, carrots, or any crops in which the edible portion of the crop actually touches the gray water. Those are excluded from reuse. Vegetated roofs, so green roofs, you can put gray water onto your green roof, and you also can put it into your compost pile. All of these, the common theme is that there's subsurface irrigation. So there's limited access and exposure of people to the gray water. I'm not going to go into detail on this. I'm just going to throw it out there so that you know this. So sometime in the future, Oregon's a little bit different. We've gone another step. If you treat your gray water, you actually can use it in landscape ponds or for surface drip irrigation. I'm just letting you know that. I can answer questions about that later, but I'm not going to focus on that today. So some of the basic rules for using gray water in the state so that it is done safely. First of all, gray water from kitchen sinks has to go through some sort of physical treatment process. It could be a filter, it could be a grease trap. There are various ways to do this. But as I mentioned, gray water from your kitchen sink is high in organic material, bath oils and greases, bacteria. So there has to be some level of physical treatment to reduce that if you want to harvest it from your kitchen sink. Gray water cannot originate from dishwashers or garbage disposals. This does come down from the statutory definition of gray water and how it was defined, so those are excluded. Wastewater from the washing of soiled diapers or other infectious sorts of items cannot go into a gray water reuse system. You have to send that to your disposal system. A lot of this is really common sense. You don't put nasty chemicals down your drains. I mean, that's the easy thing, that big one there. The other big thing to know is that you cannot store gray water for more than 24 hours. Untreated, what I'm going to call raw gray water, because it's high in organic material, high in solid, it degrades fairly quickly, and it will become septic, it will produce bad odors, so you cannot hold it more than 24 hours. And we define this as subsurface irrigation, and that is 2 inches of some sort of cover, like a soil, mulch, compost, over the point of gray water release. So that's how we define subsurface irrigation. And since this is subsurface, the last thing is your gray water cannot surface pond or run off your property. All right, other basic rules of how to use gray water safely. First of all, is only use gray water where you need to use gray water. And what this really boils down to is know your garden, know your yard, know your soil. So if you have very heavy clay soils, it may not be appropriate to use gray water during certain times of the year. They're going to be very tight. They aren't going to absorb water. Or you're going to have to design your system to be used on a heavy clay soil. Likewise, sandy soils, very rapid infiltration into the ground. So you need to know your soils when you think about reusing your gray water. And also know your plants and their water needs. As I mentioned, if you're going to use gray water from your laundry and it has a high pH, you don't want to apply it to acid-loving plants. So very basic sorts of things. So only use gray water when you need to use it. So this is pretty key. And what I have up here, these are some charts that are taken from around the state. These are from 2010. And without going into a lot of detail, the red lines are the amount of precipitation in inches we get per year. The blue lines are the amount of water that plants need. And so really, when you want to use gray water is when that blue line is above the red line. This is kind of a level of detail that designers might want to know just to have an idea of how much gray water you need to harvest. But the really practical way of operating your gray water system, the plants need the water, give them some water. Avoid using products that can harm soils and plants. Salts and sodium compounds can have negative impacts on the soil. Boron or borax That's a problem with a lot of plants. Chlorine bleach. It's a very commonly used. A lot of people promote using chlorine for disinfection. Realize that if you're cleaning with chlorine, that has negative impacts on plants and soil. Any harsh chemicals. Clearly, you don't want to put that in your gray water system. Do not eat plants or vegetables that come in contact with gray water. The risks probably of getting sick from eating gray water irrigated plants is probably low, but the reality is the risk is there. You don't know what somebody, especially if you have somebody who's staying in your house or somebody who's sick, you don't know what's going out in your gray water. There can be bacteria, there can be viruses, so just bear that in mind. If your gray water surfaces and you have tomatoes laying in a pool of gray water, you should compost those and don't eat those. All right, so the basics. How can I begin using gray water? So on the back table, I put out a guide that's called Reusing Gray Water in Your Landscape, a guide for Oregon homeowners. Some very basic steps, kind of steps you through the ways of how you can actually reuse gray water. And I'll go through, in another shorter presentation, we'll kind of go through that a little bit in more detail. The second thing is apply for your building permits. So most gray water systems are going to require that you get a plumbing permit. If you're in new construction, that's pretty straightforward. If you're retrofitting your house, you actually have to go in and you get that permit. And then lastly, go ahead and you have to apply and get a permit from DEQ. So this was something that came directly from the legislature. You have to have a DEQ permit for a gray water system. And there's a lot of places that you can get a lot, additional information. We're trying to put information on the DEQ website. There are some really interesting resources available on the web or out on the web. So other states have some gray water programs. Washington has a new gray water program similar to Oregon. San Francisco has got a very great gray water guide that they've published. I actually have a copy back there that you can kind of flip through if you want to look at that. Their Awake's Design is well known for their gray water systems. I know there's some publications back there you can look at. There's a lot of resources available. And then also look at what local resources you have. So think about the Jackson Soil and Water Conservation. They are, I think, very willing to help people know about gray water, know what their sites are like, help people evaluate if it's a good site and a good place to reuse gray water. So there's a lot of resources available. And DEQ also is available for questions on gray water systems as well. And in DEQ, we break the state up into 3 regions. And so the person that you would contact for out of Ashland, the person, if you're in Ashland, you would contact is a guy named Dan Wiltsey. He's kind of the local contact for gray water in the southwestern part of the state. And I think with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Great. So before we get started with questions, I would like you to, this is just more general questions. We're going to break into 2 sections for the community and the professionals. So we'll just do some questions. We do have some time, so go ahead.
Yes?
Why are you not encouraged, or why are you discouraged to use kitchen water for flushing the toilet?
That comes from plumbing code. So I don't really have the answer for why they made that decision. But I suspect it's because kitchen sinks are really, if you think about most people in culinary preparation, there's a lot of organic chemicals that goes down. So I just think there's a lot more treatment that has to go into that. Yes?
So did I understand you to say you needed a permit for both the building and the DEQ permit both?
You do. You do have to have both.
Rainwater is excluded, so that you don't need any kind of permit to collect and store rainwater?
Basically, the answer is you are correct. There's no DEQ permit required for collecting
But there's
rainwater.
hazards to that, too. I had it in the library system in Washington State, and I had to stop using it because my neighbor fed pigeons who crapped on my roof. It was really awful.
Yeah. So rainwater is a totally different regulatory scheme.
Isn't that come from the storage of rainwater, not from the harvesting of rainwater?
What's that?
It's the storage of rainwater, not the harvesting of rainwater.
I'm uncomfortable answering a lot of the rainwater things because it's not my area of expertise. But storage is going to, I don't harvest rainwater myself. I know people who do, and storage of rainwater does come with some issues. All right, in the back.
Ron, would you put the last screen slide back up, please? Thank you.
Yes.
How much do you expect any viruses or bacteria to be killed or neutralized in the soil?
Yeah, your soils are really, really effective at treating waste. So there's no question about that. And so they will actually certainly be outcompeted by natural bacteria. So yes, there will be a change in the microbial populations, no question about it. But exactly what the changes are going to be, are you eliminating the pathogens? I really don't know. So depending on, it's going to be very
Plus you have a lot of sunshine here, which is going to kill a lot of bacteria.
Yes, absolutely.
They're not going to survive out there.
And one thing that I will note, a lot of gray water systems that have gone in, a lot of the history in this country has been from California, Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, a lot of dry, arid parts of the country. And it does get very dry and arid in this part of the state as well. But gray water is pretty new in this part of the world, so there are probably some special considerations that we'll learn as we go along. There might be some differences. I don't know who is next. Here.
Can you address groundwater table levels and how to go about determining if your site is adequate
Sure.
for this kind of thing?
Okay. So that's a detail in another presentation. But for reusing gray water, the rules say that you have to have a 4-foot separation between the point of gray water release and groundwater at the time of reuse or at the time of irrigation. So there are various ways you can figure out how deep groundwater is on your site. You can dig a hole. You might know historically, just based on where you're at, if you're sitting on a high plateau or a terrace above a river, you might know that there's a great depth. But also some local resources. There might be well logs that are in the area.
Is that a part of the permit process to prove that?
As part of the permit process, you basically have to certify that you have evaluated your site and that at the time of reuse you understand that there has to be a 4-foot separation. Yes.
Has anybody tried any ultraviolet application to gray water going out to remove some of those nasties?
That has come up. People have talked about it, but I don't know specifically with gray water. Certainly UV disinfection is very common with wastewater. Certainly it could be done. There are mechanisms to do that. Under these gray water rules, it's much more complicated. It's a higher permit just because there's that disinfection component. But it is possible. Sure.
How could you send your gray water to a wetland if you have a wetland on property? Since it's got to be 2 inches underground, or is that impossible to do?
So this would be a wetland for actually sending it into.
Yeah, if you have the gray water and you want to put it into, it's kind of like a pond or more actually like a wetland, or say a bioswale, okay, on your property. So the water might come to the surface, during a heavy rain event or whatever in the summer. It wouldn't necessarily be submerged 2 inches the entire time.
So did you get the question? So we wanted to know when or how could you discharge gray water into a wetland? Because sometimes you will get surfacing of water in that wetland. Well, the idea behind the gray water reuse program is actually a reuse. So, the idea is irrigation. So the question would be, do you actually need to be irrigating the wetland? And if you do, then make sure you're just using it at the times that you actually need supplemental irrigation. I guess that's kind of the short answer.
What if it was a small wetland used for treatment?
Okay, now there are ways to use treatment, and there's a different permit that we're actually going to use for treatment. And the idea, again, there is you've got, gray water would flow into a wetland, it would be treated, and then you could reuse it, following the treatment. That's the idea. I can talk about that separately if you want more details, but it's a different permit.
So you were talking earlier about this subcategory that you weren't going to talk about, which is being able to take graywater into landscape ponds and drip irrigation. I'm not asking you to talk about that, but can you tell us how to find that information?
Okay, so it's all going to be available, on the website, and so that's a place to go. If there's time, I can cover it very briefly.
Yeah, maybe with the professionals, if people, or we can cover them in the individual sections.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know how we are on time, so.
We're good.
We are good?
I mean, if you want to go into it, you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. So I'll cover that very briefly. And it's kind of details of permitting. There are 3 different permits we're looking at for graywater systems. The one that I've been talking about is a very, very basic permit. You basically fill out the application, you certify that everything you've said is true, you submit it to DEQ with the fee that goes along with that, you're covered. All right, so that's the most basic. If you want to use graywater for landscape ponds or drip irrigation, the requirement is that graywater has to go through some sort of treatment to reduce the BOD and the TSS. So that treatment is kind of that extra step to clean it up and make sure that you can hold it for extended periods of time, that you have had some sort of chemical alterations and biological alterations of the water. So we're calling that something that we call type 2 graywater. And the standard is that you have to show, well, there's 2 ways you can achieve this. You can buy a system that has been designed to treat the water to that level and certified to do that. Or if you wanted to do it like in a wetland, you can do that. And we call that a performance-based system. This is kind of new. No other states have done this, and so our advisory committee really wanted to see us to give us this opportunity in Oregon. So the only requirement there is you do that. You have to submit your designs to us so that we see what you're doing, and then we would do the approval. The added thing on those systems is, if they're performance-based, is we ask that you grab a sample once a year, take it to a lab, and just show that you've actually met the treatment requirements. Yes?
Since you talk about laundry being a source of gray water, is there anywhere where there's a list of brands of soap and type of soap that is safe? I mean, biodegradable might not be enough.
That's a great question. I don't keep lists for those sorts of things. I mean, it's kind of a tricky world to get into because product manufacturers can put anything they want really on their product labeling. So I think if you're going to biodegradable, you're probably heading in the right direction, but there still are no guarantees. I mean, for what could
OasisDesign.net has a list of recommended.
And you can
products.
get a special order from the cost. So.
All right. Is there one over here? Over there. Okay.
Just out of curiosity, can you briefly describe the third type of graywater permit?
Okay. The third type of permit is designed for much more complicated, for very high volume. So if you're thinking about a dormitory on a campus, you're reflecting water, so high volume. It also involves applications where people want to disinfect the gray water and reuse it for sprinkler irrigation. It's what we call an individual permit. It's a very time-consuming, and it's much more expensive, and there's a lot of monitoring involved. Really, we included it because we were asked to include it. My personal bias would be, if you're actually going to that level of treatment, you might as well, why just treat the gray water, treat everything. Here first, I think.
Quick question about drip irrigation and the amount of solids that end up inside of this gray water would I would think could potentially really clog those systems. Talk about that.
Yeah, that certainly is an issue that people have had concerns about. I'm not an irrigation expert, and so in terms of when we were designing this program, we're leaving some of that to the other irrigation professionals to figure that one out. There's a question over here. Yes.
Yeah, so it seems like most people would be interested in the type 2, so that you can use drip irrigation, get it above ground for uses. How much more complex is that to go from type 1 to 2, and can you touch at all on cost?
Sure. In terms of permitting costs, absolutely.
Overall cost?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so there are a couple of different costs. I mean, there's the cost of actually putting in the system, and those costs are going to vary based upon how you do it and what sorts of materials you use. I've heard people talk about from $100 or less to put in a Graywater system of the most simple, basic type for materials and time, up to thousands of dollars. So, anybody's guess. In terms of permitting costs, the differences are going to be that subsurface irrigation. The initial, when you first get the permit, it's $90. So that covers new application fees. It covers our cost for writing the permits. And then, without going into the details of the complicated structures that DEQ has for permitting and fees, there is a $40 annual fee that's associated with that permit, but we are going to waive that 4 out of 5 years. So it ends up being $40 every 5 years for that particular permit. Now, for the more complicated systems, because you do submit to us designs and there is review, the initial fee on that, I believe, is $534, and there's a $50 annual fee because there's potentially monitoring that goes on with that. Again, there's complexities in how we have to charge fees, but thank here.
I just, if it's okay, I just wanted to respond to Jim's comment about irrigation. And just a general comment is that when we think of drip irrigation, it's not quite the same as we normally think about it in terms of the design of the system, because it's when you design a drip irrigation system for landscape from Graywater, there are things that you do to account for the potential solids and whatnot. So it's important to kind of get your head around like that. We're not talking apples and apples when we talk about drip systems, and we're not talking about lawn irrigation necessarily. There's very expensive, complex, over-complex systems to do that, but this is a way to irrigate really simply, and it's not apples for apples. I think that's really important. Good
point. I mean, and I've seen system designs that I wouldn't call them drip irrigation.
Right.
Kind of running things into mulch basins around trees, and really it's not dripping. I mean, it's really water running into stuff. It's really a flood irrigation.
Subsurface flood irrigation.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
If we wanted to irrigate a living roof or green roof, in most cases I imagine you have to pump Graywater. How does it do in pumps?
I think you're going to have some of the same concerns that pumping Graywater has a lot of solids, and if you get biofilms that grow into it, that could be a problem. But it's really one that's going to be on the design side of things. If you want to do it, be careful about the design and make sure that you have ways that you can clean those pumps or feel confident that the water's clean enough not to cause a problem.
Yeah. All right, very good. So what I'd like to do now, thank you very much, Ron.